My name is Jo Ivester again. Welcome to Girls' Night In Online. A wonderful series of lectures and classes, and I'm just delighted to have all of you joining us tonight, or this afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. There's basically, the way today's going to work is I'll talk for about half an hour. I'll share a little bit from my recent book, which is Once a Girl, Always a Boy. And I'll tell you some stories about my son. I'll be talking about what does it mean to be transgender. And then after half an hour, I will turn to the chat line and see where you've posted questions. So you'll have to bear with me while I skim through the questions, and then I'll try to answer them. And I will stick around as long as you've got questions. And as you're thinking of your questions, please keep in mind that you are free to ask anything. And I may say that there are some boundaries and I won't talk about everything, but please go ahead and ask the questions. This is really an opportunity to explore a subject area with which many of you may not have any familiarity. So again, my name is Jo Ivester, and 30 years ago, we welcomed our son Jeremy into the world as what we thought was our daughter. We were wrong. As he grew, he showed that he preferred the toys and games that our society thinks of as masculine. He always would pick boys' clothes. We had two older kids at that point, one boy, one girl, and we had hand-me-downs from both. Jeremy always picked his big brother hand-me-downs for clothing, for toys. He was happiest with his hair short. All his friends were little boys. And we called him a tomboy. That's what he called himself. And then in his mid-20s, he had what's called top surgery, which means he had his breasts removed to give himself a more masculine shape. He began hormones, which lowered his voice and gave him the beard that you see here. And he changed his name, changed his pronouns, and told the world he's Jeremy. And I was just so incredibly impressed with his courage and his willingness to speak about himself that I asked him as a writer and as a mom if I could write a book about him and if I could become active in the advocacy world. And he said yes. So that's the background of how we're ending up here today together. I do want you to know that my son is very much a part of this process, this undertaking, and I would not have done anything without his explicit permission and willingness. And now it's not him coming along for the ride with me, it's him being an activist himself. So there's quite a story behind this young man. So I want to start, though, by going back again to his childhood with really the first signs that if we'd been in today's world with the language that we have today, the vocabulary, the understanding, we might have said to his pediatrician, hey, do you think it's possible that Jeremy's transgender? And his childhood could have been very, very different. As it was, we saw a tomboy, and we were just fine with that. We wanted all our kids to have all the opportunities possible available to them, and we didn't want to constrain them by gender stereotypes. So when he wanted to play with trucks, we played with trucks. When he wanted to wear his brother's hand-me-downs, he played with his brother's hand-me-down toys. So I want to take you now to preschool age, 4 years old. And I'm going to do a very brief reading from my book, but the scenario is that I took him in for a haircut. And at the time, his hair was around shoulder length. It wasn't real short. And the stylist didn't do a really good job. Basically, she was used to cutting little boy hair and didn't know what to do with long hair, and so it was coming out uneven. And as I'm watching in the mirror, Jeremy is kind of pulling on his hair on one side, trying to make it longer to match the other side. So even though he was only 4 years old, he had a pretty good feel for what was happening and that he didn't like it. And so I was telling him not to worry. And this is what happened coming out of that. And I'm going to put on my glasses and forgive me for a moment while I get my material up on my screen. So we're in the haircutting salon, and I'm saying, "Don't worry, sweetie, I'll fix it when we get home." Jeremy trusted me. He stopped squirming in his seat, smiled at the hairdresser, and settled in to wait. The moment he was done, he jumped up and ran to the car saying, "Mommy, it's okay. You'll make it look better." I didn't know until an hour later just how prophetic his words had been. The moment we got home, we headed straight for the bathroom. I dragged my desk chair in from my study and placed it facing the mirror. Jeremy climbed up, eager to see how I was going to change his bedraggled appearance. "Have you ever done this before?" he asked. "Sure," I answered, with more confidence than I felt. "I used to trim Ben's hair all the time." "What are you going to do? How do you know where to cut? Will I look like Ben when you're done?" His questions tumbled out faster than I could answer, so I just went to work. I had to trim the hair really short before I could get it to look right. I don't know whether it was my inexperience with the scissors or the growing grin on Jeremy's face, but for some reason, I kept on cutting. And the more I cut, the more Jeremy beamed. By the time I was done, he looked exactly like Big Brother Ben had 3 years earlier when he was 5 years old. Jeremy had a traditional boy's haircut, parted at the side and clipped neatly around the ears, long enough to need a comb, but not so long as to require brushing. I didn't have the words to explain why Jeremy was ecstatic, but for the first time since becoming aware of how he looked, I could tell that he liked what he saw. Despite not understanding completely, I shared his joy. It didn't matter to me that his pleasure in looking like a boy was unusual. All I cared about as a mother was that somehow, in some way, I'd made my child happy. That's really all we care about as parents when it comes down to it. We want to make our children happy. And in Jeremy's case, this made him happy. Now, I want to point out my use of his name, Jeremy, and that I talk about him as a little boy. Just looking at the title of my book, Once a Girl, Always a Boy, you can tell that I now think of Jeremy that he was always a boy. He was a boy when he was 4 years old and when we put him in a dress. We just didn't know it, so we viewed him as a girl. In my book, I made the somewhat difficult decision to use female pronouns and his birth name for the first half of the book until the moment that he declared himself, that he said, "I'm Jeremy, I'm a man." And that was very awkward for me because it's not how I thought of him. When I first wrote it, it said Jeremy throughout. It was the way you just heard it. My editor said to me, "Jo, you're denying your reader the opportunity to go on Jeremy's journey with him. And if you will say his birth name and pronouns for the first half, then the reader will feel that journey." And I decided to trust her. I did reach out first to several friends who were advocates in the transgender community because I wanted to get their take on it. And basically there was a lot of reticence saying, we don't like to encourage use of birth names. For some transgender individuals, it's considered very hateful to do so, and I wanted to respect that. But when everybody heard that Jeremy was okay with it and that there was a reason for it, they said, "Okay, Jo, you can do this." And so I did, and my apologies if there is anybody listening who disagrees with that decision and is made uncomfortable by it. My intentions are supportive, and what I'm hoping is to increase understanding. And so that's all I'll say about it, except that you will hear me repeatedly today refer to Jeremy, even when I'm describing him as a child. So early childhood was actually pretty easy for Jeremy, because we just accepted him as a tomboy and let him dress and appear the way he wanted to. We were never coming to a crisis. He didn't say to us, "Mommy, I'm a boy." His big sister, writing about him when she was doing an assignment at school at 10 years old, and so Jeremy was right around 5 years old, his big sister wrote that Jeremy wanted to be a boy. So she was picking up on it, even though we hadn't said those words. But things got harder as he hit puberty, because two things happened. One was that internally, he felt that his body wasn't developing the way he wanted it to. He hated the fact that he had curves, and it just never felt right. The other thing was that all these little friends he had, all these guys who had been his playmates from preschool, and that he played sports with, he was actually playing football with them, they started rejecting him because they didn't know how to deal with what they perceived as a girl acting like a boy, and they weren't comfortable around him. So that in middle school, for example, if some of his football teammates were standing around talking and Jeremy showed up, they might stop the conversation. And what he has said to me since then is, I don't know what they were talking about, whether they were talking about girls or whether they were talking about their junk, his term, not part of my terminology in general, but they stopped talking. And he said the girls weren't any better, that they would literally send him away. So if a group of his girlfriends, his teammates from his school sports where he was on the girls' teams, they could be talking, he'd show up, and they'd all of a sudden get silent and then tell him literally, go away, go sit with the boys. And his best guess is that they were talking about boys or talking about some personal stuff about being girls. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, we'll never know, because Jeremy wasn't a part of it. So his middle school years and his high school were very isolated, and we didn't understand why. We knew that something wasn't right for him, but we weren't able to help because we didn't know. Part of why I now share our story and wrote my book is because I want more people to know. Because my feeling is that no kid should have to go through what Jeremy went through, that even though we were a loving, supportive family, because we didn't know any better, we weren't able to provide him the opportunities that, in retrospect, I wish we could have provided. It's an opportunity lost. So let me move on, though, with his story and bring him into his 20s. He might have continued for a long time using his birth name, calling himself she, but feeling really uncomfortable with it. But things in our family kind of brought stuff to a head for him. And that was that his older sister asked him to be her maid of honor. And Jeremy was initially just really delighted with this. I mean, that's a statement of how close they were as siblings. It's kind of what sisters do for one another. And he said yes. And it was only over the intervening months as the wedding grew closer that he thought about, well, what did it mean to be the maid of honor? And how was he going to have to dress as the maid of honor? And the closer we got to the wedding, the more uncomfortable he became. And in particular, the idea of the dress that he would have to wear was just very upsetting to him. And I'm going to share one more reading with you that actually is where my book opens. And if any of you have the book and are trying to read along, I will warn you, it's a cutting. It is the start of the book, but what's in it, half a dozen pages, I've narrowed down to about 2. So you'll have to jump ahead if you're trying to follow along. But the setting now is that The wedding is getting close, and the box with the maid of honor dress has arrived in the mail. And Jeremy's trying to figure out how he feels about this. I dreaded its arrival for months. When the box came, I'd left it unopened, not wanting to deal with what it contained. I'd tried to push it out of my mind, tried to ignore how it made my stomach clench with anxiety. I didn't even want to think about the dress inside, let alone look at it. Why had I said yes when my big sister Liz asked me to be her maid of honor? I'd known right away that it felt wrong, but the thought of disappointing Liz kept me awake at night, a rock in the pit of my stomach. Picturing myself wearing the bridesmaid dress was even worse. Finally, 6 weeks before the wedding, I used a kitchen knife to cut the seal on the box and opened it, determined to look at what lay inside. Inhaling deeply and gritting my teeth, I slowly reached for the blue chiffon gown. I pulled it from its packaging and spread it on my bed. All I had to do was try it on. I could do that, I told myself, wincing at the thought. I should do that, but not yet. I'd wait until I got home from school. All day, with every word of every lecture, my mind drifted back to my bedroom, to the dress waiting for me. Arriving home after class, I walked slowly into my bedroom. My pulse racing, I stripped down and slipped the dress over my head. On somebody else, I would have thought it beautiful, no question, but not on me. I cringed at the thought of wearing it in front of everybody. I cringed because that flowing dress was so totally and completely inappropriate for me, a prison uniform instead of a beautiful gown. It was the exact opposite of what I like, of who I am. I'm not feminine, and I don't want to look that way. My throat tightened as I felt my eyes tear up in frustration. Deciding to face my anxiety head on, I stood in front of my mirror and looked at the person staring back. I shuddered at my reflection, at the tightly fitting bodice that pushed up and magnified my breasts, accentuating every curve. I hunched my shoulders forward, trying to make my shape less noticeable, but it didn't work. My reflection smiled back at me, but it was a sad smile. Leaving the safety of my room, I walked over to where my roommate was sitting in his usual spot in our living room. I raised my arms and spun around, allowing him to take it all in. Seeing the devastation on my face, he finally spoke. "You have to tell her. You're tearing yourself apart." He was right. I couldn't think of anything else. I hate my body. I have ever since puberty, when there was no avoiding that my body was turning into a woman. I'm not supposed to have curves on my hips and breasts. I'm supposed to be flat. I know that. I just have no idea what to say to my big sister. Jeremy had no idea what to say to his big sister, and I was just beginning to have an idea of what he was going through. But he did deal with his angst, pulled it together, and called his sister. He hung up a couple times, but on the third try, he let the call go through. It was actually a Zoom call. And he told her he couldn't wear the dress, and he had a proposal, which was that he would wear the same slacks as all the groomsmen, and a dress white shirt, a man's shirt, and a vest that was the same color as all of the bridesmaids. And my oldest, my daughter Elizabeth, said yes. She didn't know what was going on in Jeremy's, in his mind and what his ideas were, because Jeremy wasn't ready to share. I started to know, but I couldn't say anything because it wasn't my story to tell. But Elizabeth said yes, and the wedding was just amazing. Jeremy stood up there with the bridesmaids by Elizabeth's side, and we had a beautiful wedding. Well, a lot changed in 4 months. My oldest son, Ben, got married, and his fiance at the time, now my daughter-in-law, came up with a proposal, which was to say, you know what? Jeremy feels more comfortable in men's clothing. Let him wear the same suit and tie, tuxedo that all the men are wearing. And then said, and he can stand by my side instead of by yours. So that was the second wedding. And by the time the decision was made to go ahead and do it that way, Ben still didn't know what was going on with Jeremy. But by the time of the wedding, he did. Because by the time of the wedding, Jeremy had shared with his siblings that he was heading in for surgery 3 weeks later. And I flew to Florida, Jeremy flew to Florida, and we had this incredible week together following his surgery. We stayed in a hotel room, and I took care of him. And we had just wonderful conversations about what the future might hold. One of those conversations was him saying, I don't think I'm transgender. This was just physical dysphoria. My chest felt wrong. So I don't think I'm going to do anything more. But if I did, I don't want to just pick a name that's a popular baby name today. I want to pick a name that you would have picked for me if you knew when I was born that I was your son. And we had some wonderful conversations about that. I actually stood in line at the checkout line at the grocery store looking through a book of baby names, and then came back to the hotel room where we were staying and shared them with him. And I didn't know at the time, but I named him his second time round. I gave him the name Jeremy. And that was pretty amazing to me. I found out almost a year later when he said he was going to start using a new name with his friends, and at some point in the future, he would make an announcement to the wider circle. Well, I didn't know when that announcement was coming or in what form, but one day I logged onto Facebook, and there it was. Jeremy had posted, hey guys, you might have noticed that my name changed. So now I'm Jeremy. Please start using my new name and start using male pronouns. And I want you to know I'm about to go on hormones in a couple weeks, and my voice is going to change, and I might grow a beard, and I'm basically going to go through male puberty. So long. That's what he posted. That's how I knew he had made this announcement. Well, once he had posted and it was public, that freed me up to share as well. So I did my own posting, in which I said that I was proud to tell all of my family and friends that I now have 3 sons, and that Jeremy was the bravest person I knew, that his decision to live as his authentic self was one of the most courageous acts I had ever seen, and that we'd been with him every step of the way and would continue to be by his side no matter where his journey took him. Well, initially, that Facebook posting got some wonderful warm responses, both from our circle of friends and from a little bit beyond it, where people had shared, and they were sending me Facebook messages saying, thank you for being such a supportive mom. And in particular, folks from within the LGBT community were saying, it's great to see a supportive mom. And that felt good. I felt like, okay, I've done something good here. And then I started getting some very sad letters from young transgender men who identified with Jeremy and had been kicked out of their homes when they came out to their parents. Young men who were in their late teens, early 20s, who had no place to live, who were couch surfing with friends, and if they couldn't find that, they were on the street. And I looked at that, and it was heartbreaking, and I decided I had to do something. And so I started to try to learn more. I went online and learned everything I could find. I read it, I absorbed it, I read books, I watched TV shows and movies, anything I could find, and I realized I had to become an advocate, and I had to do something about it. And so that's kind of what leads me to be here today. My feeling is that when we share our personal stories, it makes it much more obvious to everybody that transgender people are just people, Jeremy doesn't want to walk into a room and be Jeremy the trans guy. He just wants to be Jeremy the guy. And that will only happen when, as a society, we become more comfortable and more accepting. And the political environment is painful. We were making progress under the previous administration, but today we see step after step that is antagonistic toward our transgender community. The first thing we saw was a ban on transgender individuals serving in the military. And most recently, we've seen a ruling that says that medical personnel can refuse treatment to transgender individuals. So if my son Jeremy were in a car accident and got taken to an emergency room, legally, they'd have to make sure he was gonna make it. They'd have to provide life-saving treatment, but they could stop at that point and say, you know, someone else has to take care of other things. It's not right. In Texas, we had the transgender bathroom bills where our politicians were trying to gain political points by saying that transgender people couldn't use the restrooms that they felt made sense. When Jeremy walks into a men's room, that's what makes sense. If he walked into a women's room, he might make people uncomfortable, and he wouldn't want to do that. So we fight. And along the way, we have run into just some wonderful fellow advocates. One of them I am trying to amplify today, Freedom for All Americans. When you registered for this, you would have heard a little bit about them. They are a national advocacy organization. It is bipartisan, so both Republican and Democrat, it doesn't matter. They are fighting for LGBTQ rights. And the payment that Girls Night In Online pays to me, I am just turning around and donating it right back to them. And the way Girls Night In Online works is there's a tip jar. You can find the information in the chat line, and I will match anything that you choose to donate to Freedom for All Americans. This is something I care about very deeply. And my ask to you before we go to questions is for you to help me raise awareness that now that you know a little bit about who Jeremy is, maybe you feel like he's kind of a friend in some ways, that if you hear someone saying something inappropriate or derogatory or making a joke about being transgender, that you'll say, you know, hey, wait a minute. I know someone whose son is transgender, and he's deserving of the same dignity and respect that we all are. Because our silence is not acceptable. Our silence provides an assumption that we agree. So please speak out. Please vote for representation in our political world that will respect our transgender community. Go to your schools and ask that they have policies that are inclusive. And just in general, by being supportive and being there on a very personal level, you can make a huge difference. So I appreciate the opportunity to share our family's story with you. I hope that you feel after this half hour that you kind of know Jeremy and you understand a little bit more about what it means to be transgender. I haven't given kind of formal definitions the way you might in a class on what it means to be transgender, but have chosen to instead illustrate with stories. But I'm happy to go into any kind of detail on questions that you like. If something is beyond a boundary that Jeremy has asked me not to cross, I'll just say that. So thank you so much for being here, for your attention, for your interest in the subject. And for your future support. And if you are here listening because you are part of the LGBTQ community, or in particular because you are part of the transgender community, I want to thank you and tell you you've got another ally and advocate in me. And I will do what I can. This is my chosen work because I care about it so passionately. So with that, I'm going to kind of Thank you. I'm gonna not be looking at the screen for a moment because I'm gonna look over at the chat line, and my apologies that I kind of can't do both at the same time. So the first question is, what made me choose Freedom for All Americans? They first came to my awareness when Massachusetts recently passed a statewide non-discrimination ordinance that includes protecting the rights of transgender people. And Freedom for All Americans was one of the key advocacy organizations that made that happen. And I looked at what they had accomplished and saw a very well thought out strategy with individuals who were working in as colleagues with all of the rest of the advocacy world, and they were conveners. They were pulling everybody together. And so it was a matter of being impressed with what they accomplished in Massachusetts, with their message, and with the individuals who were running it. I then had the opportunity to meet Casey Suffredini, who's the current president of the organization. I heard him give a talk. I was moved to tears. Casey is a transgender man himself, and so knew exactly from his own experience what he was talking about. And I couldn't have been more impressed. And that was a few years ago, and I have continued to be impressed with everything that they have done with their strategic approach. And that's really why I wanted to work with them for today. Thanks for that question. Has Jeremy's father been as supportive from Julie? Yes, absolutely. My husband is amazing, and he is probably in the background somewhere here, and so he can hear me saying this, but so I may embarrass him with my praise. But I want to tell you a quick story that illustrates his support. He used to be the executive vice president for worldwide operations for a high-tech company, for Silicon Labs. And at one point, his attitude was that he should keep his political and his professional lives separate, that he could be totally supportive of Jeremy personally, and he has been from the very first, but that it wasn't his role to speak out at work, that he didn't want to make colleagues uncomfortable. Well, somewhere along the line, between fellow advocates and colleagues at his work, he said, you know what? I will make my company a better company if I speak out. And the first opportunity he had was at an Anti-Defamation League dinner in Austin, attended by about 600 or 700 people from the community, many of them leaders, many of them joining us from my husband's company. And John and I actually were being honored that evening as for what they called a humanitarian award for the work we had done, not just in the transgender advocacy world, but in civil rights in general and in the community. So we'd lived there 25 years, so we'd kind of been involved. As part of getting the award, two things happened. One was we got a $1,000 honorarium to give to any organization we chose, any eligible charitable organization, and we got 4 minutes each to speak to this assemblage of 700 people. So the organization we picked was Equality Texas, and that was because they had been such strong advocates fighting against the bathroom bills in Texas, and so we loved that as an organization, and I'm currently on their board. And in the 4 minutes that John had to speak, he turned to this group that before this time might have had no idea who our son is, and he described what it means for Jeremy to be transgender. And he talked about how proud he was of Jeremy, how much he loved him and supported him. And I will tell you, as I looked around the room, I saw people crying. And when we'd finished speaking and we were leaving the stage to go back to the table where our whole family sat, Jeremy didn't wait for us to get to the table. He ran halfway across the room, and he just embraced John, almost knocking him over. And if anyone hadn't been crying before then, they started crying at that moment. John's support of Jeremy has been fantastic from day one. And John will go out and speak with me. And as I well, right now I can't travel the country because of the pandemic, but when I am able to do that again, he will be with me. And he just is everything a transgender individual could want in the way of a supportive dad. And it's really important because moms are quick to support in most cases. Moms, they put aside their politics or whatever discomfort they may have because it's their kid and they love their kid. And for whatever reason, our experience had been that fathers take a little more time. So for them to see in John a role model of an accepting father is really important. And there are times where the two of us will, say, go out for lunch with the parents of a child who has just recently come out as transgender. And John and the dad can talk about what does it mean and how important it is to accept. And when we're talking with those parents, we're doing a few things. We're sharing our story, which is just people, when they hear our story, they don't feel as alone about their own story. We ask them a lot of questions so that they can start to share their story with us. And we give them some of the basic facts about the importance of support. Over 40% of transgender teenagers have tried to kill themselves. Not just thought about it, but actually tried. And so having a parent support it may not eliminate that difficulty, the tremendous challenge that a child or a teenager feels, but it sure helps. And when you think about, do I try to change my kid and maybe push them further in that direction, or do I support my kid? A lot more parents will choose support. Let me take another look at this. A few thank yous in here, and I appreciate that. It says, I noticed that you wrote in first person from, let's see, I have to move this, from Jeremy's point of view rather than mine. So how did I decide as a writer how to present the book? It actually isn't first person Jeremy all the way through. That's the most common, but it's a family memoir. And by that I mean all of our voices are there. There's mostly my voice and Jeremy's voice. So the first anecdote that you heard about the haircut was in my voice, my perspective. But there are sections that are in John's voice and sections that are in Jeremy's siblings' voices and his sister-in-law's voice. So the idea was I wanted people to be able to see what it was like, not just for Jeremy, but for the whole family, because the whole family really does get involved and needs to get involved. And it was not easy. And I would interview my kids. They would then read what I wrote up from the interviews, and they'd tear them apart and put them back together to improve the accuracy and the honesty and to try to capture their own voices. So we really did work together on this. And my reason for doing that and trying to get everyone's perspective in was because I thought it was important, and there's nothing else like it out there. And I wanted there to be. I wanted this to become a way of helping families to figure things out when their kid is on some sort of a journey, not even just a transgender journey, but any sort of figuring out who they are. So that was my goal, and I had a fantastic editor who challenged me to keep taking it further and keep including more family members. And as a result of that, the family ended up having to talk with each other, because some of the passages, you'll see if you read it, you hear the same story from multiple perspectives, and those perspectives are different and the memories are different. So the same story that might have been a real turning moment for Jeremy and something that caused him a lot of anxiety and frustration and was in the back of his head for years, his siblings might not even have remembered that conversation happened. And so it was important to have everybody put all of that on the table and trust each other to talk about it. And some walls had gone up that did come down as a result of this family undertaking. Gosh. So how can parents support their transgender child? I love this question. Hopefully I've provided some ideas. The first thing I would say is that just saying over and over again that you love your kid and that you accept them is huge. And you might not think that's that unusual, but it is. And transgender kids are constantly feeling like they're unusual and unaccepted, and their families can help so much. And I should say, as I make that comment, there is no one transgender journey. There's no one right way to be transgender. So I've talked about my son Jeremy, who was very clear once he started on his journey that he is a man. There are people who say, you know what, I'm neither a man nor a woman, or I'm both a man and a woman. And I may feel differently one day from another day. I may choose one day to go out in a suit and tie and the next day to go out wearing a dress. And those are all real, and they are all true experiences for transgender people. So any comments I make about Jeremy, keep in mind that there's this broader world of people who are transgender, kind of an umbrella of covering a wide range. I would say that the first thing, if you think your child is transgender, and this is advice you can give to friends or if you're listening for yourself, bring your child's pediatrician into the discussion, that medical professionals have been learning about what it means to be transgender, and if your child's pediatrician is not supportive and is not willing to learn, get a new one, if at all possible. Find the medical person that understands what your child is going through. Then as the child is figuring things out, having a therapist who is experienced helping people work through gender issues can be really, really important. In Jeremy's case, when he decided he wanted to have top surgery, he legally had to get counseling for a year. And he had to get a letter from a doctor. It might not have been a year, it might have been 6 months, but he had to get a letter from a licensed therapist that said that Jeremy was an appropriate candidate for gender transition surgery or gender reassignment surgery. He is so glad that he had to go to a therapist because he might not have otherwise, and it really, really helped him. So I would say to get a child therapist involved. Again, someone who understands what it means to be transgender. And early on, the support for a child is just letting them express themselves the way they want. So no one at 5 or 6 years old is talking about surgery or talking about hormones. It's purely social. It's how do you wear your hair? What do you call yourself? What pronouns do you use? Do you sign up to play baseball or do you sign up to play softball? Since in our society, those sports are largely different. Jeremy, even when we were viewing him as a girl, signed up to play baseball, and he was happier there, and so we were just fine with that. But in soccer, he played on a girls' team because that's just the way it was set up. So supporting your child means letting them present the way they are most comfortable, and it might change. Your child might say one year that I am wanting to present as a boy, and maybe they'll say later, I want to present as a girl. And about 75% of children pre-puberty will be pretty consistent in how they want to present themselves, and about 25% aren't. But once they hit puberty, our youth are very consistent. So if a child is now a teenager or preteen and is in puberty, what they say sticks the vast majority of the time. Very, very few cases where someone says no on something other than what I said I was. And in those cases, often it's that they were still exploring their sexuality and they were kind of not sure on their gender versus their sexuality. And so it gets really complicated. As you move from elementary school into the end of elementary and middle school, your pediatrician and therapist may be saying, let's use puberty blockers. This is a reversible medical approach that pushes out puberty to give the child a chance to discover who they are. And it is a medically recognized approach that is safe and reversible, that just gives the child time. If we had known about this when Jeremy was a child, we would have had him on blockers. He would never have developed breasts. He would never have needed top surgery. And he would have had the teenage years that he deserved, where he would have been living his life as Jeremy already. Then as you get into the mid-teens, late teens, early 20s, the individual may say, you know what, I want hormones. I want to change my voice, if in Jeremy's case, I want to lower my voice. I want to be able to grow facial hair. Or someone who says, I am a trans woman, might want to go on testosterone blockers and take hormone replacement therapy to soften the face and to eliminate hair, soften the curves. So the support of the child changes over time, and it needs to be done you need to create a team that is the physician, the pediatrician, the therapist, and eventually an endocrinologist who would be involved with blockers or hormones. So I hope I answered that. And eventually, in another couple of minutes, I'm going to be unmuting you so that you can ask follow-on questions if we're not using the chat line anymore, or just to be able to say hi and goodbye. But let's see if we have any other questions. So at this point, I see that more questions are being typed, but I don't see any more at the moment. So I will go into a question that I get that hasn't been asked yet, and that is, how is Jeremy doing now? So Jeremy is now 30 years old, and he has flourished. He was not an unhappy teenager, despite his social isolation. He's always been a basically happy person, but just someone who was dealing with a lot. Now he is just flourishing. For a long time, he was living in Colorado. That's where he was when he figured everything out. And it was a very, very supportive state, and it has protections for the LGBTQ population. You can't be kicked out of your home because, have your lease pulled out from under you because your landlord doesn't like you being somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. So Colorado was great for him. And I wanted him to come back to Texas just because, as mom, I wanted my kids here in Texas. And he said, I can't come back. The politicians are just making life too hard for the LGBTQ population in general and the trans population in particular. And then 4 years ago, our oldest had her first baby. And Jeremy came and visited for a month to be with the family again and to get to know the new baby. And Jeremy had worked in a daycare facility for a couple of years, knew how to take care of babies. And his big sister asked him, the same sister who had asked him to be the maid of honor, said, Jeremy, will you come back to Texas and get a place near us and help taking care of our kids? And Jeremy, at that point, having spent a month kind of in the embrace of the family, said, I can't not be a part of this kid's life. I don't want this kid to think of me as Uncle Jeremy in Colorado, who I can barely remember because I see him so rarely. And the Pullitt family overcame the nasty politics, and Jeremy moved back to Texas. We're now all in Austin. So we have 4 kids ranging from 25 to 35 and 5 grandkids, and Jeremy is an integral part of all of the families, and he formally helps out with daycare a couple of days a week, and when he's not doing that, he's a barista at Starbucks, and he's doing great. He has friends, he has a life, and if he were to walk in right now, you would just see a very sweet young man. And you wouldn't necessarily see a transgender person. You would just see Jeremy, who is just a really good guy. So I think there's been another question while I was updating you on Jeremy. Is he also involved in advocacy, and which organizations? So I am really proud of Jeremy. He is involved in advocacy, though he's quick to say that advocacy takes many, many forms. And for a transgender person just living their life in our society that has roadblocks for this community is a form of advocacy. Just being true to yourself is a form of advocacy. And sometimes that's what he picks to do, to just be himself. He's a shy guy, but he will step past that shyness to join me on talks. So he has come with me and will actually hand the mic back and forth, or the Zoom camera back and forth, and share anecdotes. So that reading I did about the maid of honor dress, he would have done that reading. And we would sometimes tell the same story from the two perspectives. He has a couple of times addressed the Texas, the Transgender Non-Discrimination Summit of Texas, which is an organization of college administrators that are trying to figure out how best to support college students. And so he has spoken with them, sharing stories and talking about how to be an advocate. He's addressed teachers with the Anti-Defamation League at the Teen Summit in Austin, where 120 teachers brought about 600 students all to the University of Texas Stadium for a day of training how to be an advocate. And Jeremy was the keynote speaker for the teachers. So at some point, all the students went off with someone who was going to play the guitar and appeal to 7th, 8th, and 9th graders. And Jeremy shared with the teachers what it had been like for him as a middle schooler, and was kind of just fielding their questions and giving them ideas. So yes, he is a very strong advocate. He's a good public speaker. And I really enjoy the opportunities for working together. He doesn't write, so I do any of the writing, and I then send it past him for approval. So in my book, he's approved every word, and when I'm giving a talk, if I'm broaching a subject I haven't talked about before, I send him an outline or a write-up of what I'm going to do so that he can say, yes, I'm okay with that, Mom. So he joins me in this. Can we see a photo of Jeremy? So, well, the cover, this is actually his photo. Let me move that up closer to the camera. And I'm going to pull from the book his publicity photo, which is, let's see if I can get this right up to the camera. So I think he's really a handsome young man. And I love the expressions on his face. And he's also really good with the camera. The photographer, when we were working on the book together, and the publisher said you need to send some professionally done headshots. The photographer after the session said to me, good job, Joe, and then turns to Jeremy and said, would you be a model for me? So he's good in front of the camera. Does he think about becoming a lawyer? I think he'd be fantastic at whatever he chose to do, but he does not like being a student. So he actually stopped classes when he was still an undergraduate. He was a math major, thought he was going to be a teacher, and has not gone that route. He talks about maybe going back to school, maybe in social work. I think, given that he doesn't like being a student, law is very onerous, though I think he'd be a great lawyer. I think he'll find other ways for his advocacy. And does he have a girlfriend? He does not. And he's still figuring out the dating world. For someone who is transgender, it's really hard to figure out who you're attracted to when you don't know who you are yourself. And he has struggled with trying to figure that out. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know who he will be with, if anybody. But if you were to ask him to say, where do I identify, it would be as a gay man. So maybe at some point I will have a young man who joins our family with Jeremy, whether formally or informally. Right now, there's not any person, and I have no idea what the future is going to bring for that. And I just want him to be happy. So, and thank you for the comment that he's handsome. I think so too. I love looking at his picture. It brings up. But you know what? I love looking at him and the man he is, and you can tell I'm just so proud of him. He's exhibited so much courage, and just really is a caring person. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to help others, and is willing to put himself out there to do it. And as a mother, I am so proud of him, and as a fellow advocate, I am so appreciative of him. Bye-bye.